Hello everyone and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. Another end of the year video. This time I will be talking about my 10 biggest disappointments of 2024. There is still some time left in this year, but of the 3 books I'm currently reading, I can be pretty sure they will not end at the bottom of my rating. I am enjoying all 3 of them. Let's begin by saying that 2024 was a very good reading year for me. Of the 62 books I will probably have read by the end of December, 7 scored higher than 95 points out of 100, which means 5 stars. And more than 20 books scored a 4.5 star. So I have been a happy reader most of the time. There is an invisible barrier in my rating of books, which is around the 55 point mark. Any book that scores above 55 points out of 100 deserves my appreciation. Maybe not a whole lot when the score doesn't exceed 70 points, but it means I did enjoy reading it. Anything below 55 points obviously scores higher on the negatives than on the positives. In the category below 55 points, there are only 2 books, thankfully. The other 8 on this list were more or less okay, but simply not very good books. The fact that 5 of the books on this list scored higher than 70 points indicates how good my reading year has been. The worst books are always those that I did not finish. This year I DNF'd 2 books. The first is a non-fiction book called Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East by Baird Spalding. This is the complete series I tried to read. I tried this for only 2 days to know for sure that this was not for me. Too outdated, too Christian, badly written, and too unbelievable. The other book that took me longer to put down because I really wanted to finish Fantastis by George MacDonald. Still, after less than 80 pages, I knew I was only torturing myself to keep on reading this. The book is more than 170 years old and it shows. It's one of the first books in modern fantasy, but it has aged terribly, I'm afraid. Not for me, but still glad to have made my acquaintance with this old form of fantasy. In a live stream I did with Nev on Nev's book channel, you can hear me talking more about my experience with this ancient fantasy book. Then, onto the list. Number 10 of my least favorite books of 2024 is a novel I gave 75 points out of 100, so a 3.5 star, almost 4 stars. It's not a bad book at all, on the contrary. Sorcerer's Legacy by Jenny Wirtz, published in 1982. Because I am determined to read her entire works, I want to read them in the order of publication, so I can track her development as a writer. I had very high hopes that even her debut novel would live up to the praise her later books receive on Booktube. But it did not really do that. The prose is condensed and requires the full concentration of the reader. Her mastery of the English language inspired me to underline many sentences and scribble comments in the margin. At times, the density of Wirtz's writing left me breathless, because there is not one moment where you can sit back and relax. So her prose left definitely a positive impression on me, but also a taxing one. Another thing that I didn't really appreciate was her unending effort to make the way the magic works understandable for the reader. Again, interesting but tiresome at the same time. At times it was as if I was reading a science book about something that simply cannot be explained. Also, her characters remained rather flat and one-dimensional. Then, finally, on the negative, the lack of humor was disappointing. Other than that, a good story, and no doubt a very pleasant first meeting with this author. This list clearly shows how much I struggled with Terry Pratchett's Discworld, because it holds 4 of his books. The best of those was The Light Fantastic. The second book in the series, which was a huge improvement to The Color of Magic, which we will find lower on this list. The creativity of Pratchett's language really came into its own in this book, and he is telling an entertaining story. Every appearance of Cohen the Barbarian, who in this story is a legendary warrior of 87 years of age, made me laugh out loud. Still, the confusing way the author composes his story with sidesteps, time jumps and such prevented me from giving this book a higher rating than 74 points out of 100. Number 8 is a science fiction novel by Isaac Asimov, Fantastic Voyage. The story is not originally by Asimov, but he novelized it. It's a very enjoyable small book, as you can see, that tells the story of a peculiar medical intervention. The overdose on medical terminology and the technicalities of the procedure put me off a bit. This book was published in 1966 and the prose suffers from old age. Still, the adventure is entertaining and exciting and I enjoyed reading it. I gave it 73 points out of 100. Next is another ancient fantasy book, although not as ancient as Fantastis by George MacDonald. I'm talking about The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany, which was first published in 1924. Much better than Fantastis, but still the writing style was very outdated. Almost every sentence starts with and then or and or but, which gave me the impression that I was reading a story from someone in primary school. Some elements in the stories were extremely unrealistic, and also the composition and the Christian setting were not exactly my cup of tea. What I particularly enjoyed was the way the author explores the concept of time. At times, the prose was beautiful, fairy-like, and poetic. Being 100 years old, one can say that this prose is not of this time anymore. It was a nice read overall, poetic and clumsy at the same time. I gave it 71 points out of 100. The number 6 spot on this list holds the last book that scored 3.5 stars. I liked A Hatful of Sky, the second book in the so-called Tiffany Aching sequence. In January, I read this one straight after The We Free Men, the first book in this sub-series of the Discworld, which I enjoyed very much. A Hatful of Sky took me a little bit more effort. The first half of the book is very funny, while the second half is more intriguing, touching, surrealistic and beautiful. Compared to The We Free Men, this book simply wasn't as good. It got 71 points out of 100. Now we're getting to books that are balancing on the edge of liking them or not liking them. Even though The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle is a relatively short book with 292 pages, it took me 11 days to read it. My high expectations were not met, to say the least. I found the first half of the book mostly confusing and directionless. It was too surrealistic, too allegorical, and too abstract for my taste. Thankfully, in the second half, things picked up a bit. The story got going, but the end to me wasn't very surprising or rewarding. I also kept on guessing about the true core of this story. Is it about aging and mortality, or is it about truth and reality versus dreaming? Or perhaps it is about beauty. At times the language is beautiful and the story presented me with some tender moments. However, the book didn't win me over. I gave The Last Unicorn 64 points out of 100. The third Terry Pratchett on this list is The Color of Magic. Almost everyone thinks this is one of the least books in the Discworld, and I fully agree. Rickety storytelling, no real direction, and most of the time I wondered why I was reading this. Still, it is early Pratchett, and simply because of that, it was an interesting read. The story is about the incompetent wizard Rincewind, who takes on the role of guide for the tourist Twoflower. The absurd situations both characters repeatedly find themselves in and somehow manage to escape from did not really invest me into the story. Most of the time, I just didn't care. But however flawed the story, Pratchett's magnificent mastery of the language is present on all of the pages. To summarize my reading experience of this book, I didn't really enjoy what Pratchett has to say. I very much enjoyed how he says it. What saved this book from a lower score than the 62 points it got is the part called The Lure of the Worm. This is a parody of Dragonflight, the first book in the Dragon Riders of Pern series. Apart from that, The Color of Magic, with its razor-thin, idiotic tale, is quite a forgettable book. Number 3 on this list contains the 6 books in the Millie Molly Mandy series written by Joyce Lancaster Brisley, which were recommended to me by Nev from, again, Nev's book channel. I always like to read YA books, and I also don't shy away from the occasional children's book. These 6 small books with a huge font size and very nice illustrations were mainly extremely easy to read. The adventures of the little girl Millie Molly Mandy are carefree, lovely and cozy. I believe I read all 6 of them within 2 weeks, in between other books I was reading. Even though they are high on this list of disappointments, they completely fulfilled their promise. Quick, cozy, and above all, easy reads. They didn't put any strain on my time or my attention, but still, I will not embark on such an unimpressive read anytime soon. 60 points out of 100 for all 6 of these books. To be honest, apart from the 2 DNFs, the next 2 books were my only true disappointments of this year. Yes, another Terry Pratchett. Equal Rights, to me, was such a convoluted and unbalanced book that it irritated me. I read this book while on holiday in Norway. What surprised me was that several Discworld fans had recommended this book to me as one of the best in the beginning of this huge series. It was my 7th book by Pratchett, and it has been my worst Discworld novel book for me so far. The story starts off great, but it doesn't take too long to become very boring. The story seemed to be going nowhere. Also, the humor didn't connect with me at all. Many times I realized Pratchett was making a joke, but for the life of me, I couldn't make heads or tail of it. Of the 285 pages, about 50 were to my liking. I couldn't rate this book any higher than 44 points out of 100, which compares to 2 stars. After this book, I read Mort, which cleared up the sky above Discworld for me, because after Equal Rights, I was really wondering if I am the right person to read these books. My absolute biggest disappointment of this year is a Dutch non-fiction book. This book is titled Bloeien in de Bagger by Jojo van der Kooi, which would translate as To Bloom in the Mud. Every now and then I read a book that ranks under spirituality. Most of the times these are recommendations by my wife, Loes, but this book was a gift from a good friend of mine. He was greatly impressed with the wisdom of this writer, so I started to read the book with great anticipation. It turned out to be my biggest disappointment of 2024. Me and my friend always have great conversations about spiritual matters, so I was all the more surprised that this book had been an inspiration for him. Apart from the sloppy and immature writing style, the author mainly kicks in open doors, without any real addition of her own or fresh view on things. The structure of the book, following her own biography, divided into the chakras, presented as if everyone's life follows this pattern, felt very coerced and didn't make any real sense to me. Only in the closing chapters did I glimpse something that I experienced as true wisdom. But those final 50 to 20 pages were not by a long shot worth struggling through the previous 240 pages. I'm very curious about my friend's perspective on this book because I very much value his assessment on many things. Perhaps I missed something, or maybe I wasn't in the right headspace when I read it, although I cannot recall that being the case. I could give no more than 32 points out of 100 simply for the effort of writing this book, and I'm happy to say that, as far as I can tell, it has not been translated into English. Counting my DNFs, this year I actually read only 4 books that were real bummers for me. But that would have made a disappointingly short video. Thank you very much for watching this one. Until we meet again at Dutch Greybeard.